In this episode, we have Naveen Kishore, who is the founder and managing director of Seagull Books. Born in Calcutta, Naveen Kishore received graduation in English literature in 1973 and began working as a theatre lighting designer. He established Seagull Books in 1982, a publishing program focusing on drama, film, art, and culture studies. Today, it also publishes literature including poetry, fiction, non-fiction, and English translations from 25 world languages. At present, the company has registered divisions in London, New York, and Calcutta. In 1987, Kishore established the Seagull Foundation for the Arts and set up the Seagull School of Publishing in 2012. Kishore is a photographer who has extensively documented female impersonators from Manipuri, Bengali, and Punjabi theatre practices. Kishore exhibited his work at Chatterjee Lal in Bombay in the exhibition Greenroom of the Goddess. He was awarded the 2021 Ottaway Award for the promotion of international literature and is the recipient of Goethe Medal. Welcome to our podcast. So nice of you to agree and come out to our podcast. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, so you were interested in theatre initially during your school days and college days. How it led to publishing? Please tell us about it.
Yeah, the theatre actually happened. Well, the school is, everybody does theatre in school, so that was okay. But I think it was in college that I really tasted blood, as it were, as far as theatre is concerned. But I remember there was a theatre group called the Red Curtain, and which was essentially made up of young people from different colleges who had left school, started a theatre group as the school leavers of a couple of schools, and they started to do amateur theatre, but with great quality, aesthetic, style, production values and things. And when I joined them, it was, I was a backstage person. My first theatre experience was a play called Wait Until Dark, where I used to sit behind a refrigerator with a small cassette recorder. And every time the blind leading lady opened the fridge, I would have to put on the duck, 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 the sound of the machine and synchronize it with every time she shut it. And at one point in this thriller, which was also a good film, this blind woman is trying to smash all the bulbs because she's going to be attacked by these two people. And I have to synchronize the swinging of her sort of stick to the bulbs and simulate a crash in a waste paper basket with old bulbs and a metal brass kind of weighing thing, smashing it. This was my first beginning.
Sounds too complicated.
It was good fun. You were, assisting backstage, and then immediately you were plunged into the deep end in the next play, which was Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard. And the Red Curtain was a very democratic setup. So they said, you design the sets and light. I knew nothing about it, but the British Council Library was very useful. So I used to go and study lighting, design books and stuff. But at that point, I was playing by the rules, where I was lighting your face as an actor in 45 degrees. But I was frustrated because I couldn't achieve darkness, So that was a disaster. I made a mess of it, I think. But the next play which I designed, Ibsen's Ghosts, I think I threw the rule book out of the window and I started to light the air around actors. And, in real life, you're not lit well. You could go in and out of shadows. Even now you can see, my face has a light from the top and that kind of thing. So I became a lighting design person. And what often happens in India is that sometimes life makes your hobbies become livelihood. And my father lost his job very early in life. I had to, in college, start to support. And I turned to lighting design and discovered people were willing to pay me. But there was never enough money in theatre. So I started to become what you and I now call event managers. So I presented everybody from Yamini Krishnamurti to Birju Maharaj to Begum Akhtar to, and to jazz festivals and theatre and dance. And now all of this fed into the theatre, and over a 10, 12-year period, there came a moment when we felt the need to document. The word document came into my sort of, lexicon, as it were. And I turned to a very dear, much older, wiser, scholarly being, Shomik Banerjee, who was then an editor at Oxford University Press. And he used to edit and publish for them people like Girish Karnad and Badal Sarkar and the early plays. They had a series called New Drama in India, kind of thing. We were together, I was airing my frustration about how the ephemeral nature of a certain kind of theatre activity would disappear because there was no way of freezing it. And I didn't have the words. So he says, well, publishing. If a publisher devoted to the theatre, the arts, the media, the visual, the cinema, and not worrying about feeding 400 mouths like Oxford, where you cannot survive off the slow-selling niche publishing. You have to do other things. And I liked the idea because I said to him, I didn't have a sense of scale, clearly. So, and I didn't have the money. So I said, well, we have a name. We already exist as Seagull. So Seagull Books, one more bird publisher. And
One more bird published.
that's literally how
No,
it
I thought
started.
you were referring to Jonathan Livingston Seagull. No.
No, unfortunately, no, because the name Seagull actually came, as you may have read or heard, from a rock concert I had done in '72, which was called Seagull Empire. And so, we used to present everything as Seagull. Anyway, so that's literally overnight we decided to start this, and I learned on the job. And I was lucky I fell into the hands of this wonderful editor mentor and founding editor of Seagull, Shomik Banerjee, but also we both fell into the hands of an even more interesting printer, a man called P.K. Ghosh, Prabhat Kumar Ghosh, of a legendary letterpress printing house called East End Printers. And, he was a very interesting printer because he would not say yes to a book unless he had read the manuscript. So if you and I, as colleagues, went to him with a book, he would say, leave it for me, let me read it. And or he would then discourage you and say, but I'm so expensive, why do you want to come to me? And things like that. Once he accepted your book, this printer would have discussions with you after you had copy edited it and discuss books. He was actually an editorial mind. And I learned, literally, I had no experience. But what I had was a kind of theatrical aesthetic, if you like. When you look back, you can find words for it. And so, instinctively, in a publishing culture in India, which was very suspect in the rest of the world, where people always felt we had shoddy binding, terrible lamination, cheap, it's like we couldn't do. But that was not the case, really, because I found there was good paper available, there was good binders available, there was good everything available. It was intent. If you wanted to do books cheaply, for any number of reasons, not always economical, but it could be other reasons where you felt that you had to price the book low because of, if they were textbooks. But good literature needed to be, you need the touch and feel of, something material. So I instinctively gave this printer, P.K. Ghosh of East End, the best of paper, the best grammage, four cover colors. Those were block made in those days. And he immediately understood that I was, instinctively doing in an environment with the same paper merchants that, say, in Oxford use, the same block makers, I was able to produce better looking books because the intention was there. And I wasn't, as I said, I had no sense of scale. And and we had started this company with borrowed money from a bank, literally. And we learned very quickly, and I'll jump a little here, where In independent or any publishing, you do not publish one book and then say, I'm going to sell this, then the money that comes in will produce the second book. No. The world, and particularly the world of publishing, distribution, book selling, demands that you make your presence felt by consistently bringing out books. Can be 2 books a year, can be 6, can be 60. That's not the issue. The issue is that you, as a distributor, and you, the chain that goes all the way to the bookseller and the book buyer, simply wants to know that you're going to keep producing. It's not a fly by night thing. Where you do it from, how you do it is not, you build up a list, or what we used to call a backlist, which is the spine of any good publisher. Because the serious, the nature of the publishing was very serious. After all, what were we doing? We were translating from different languages, Telugu or Tamil or Marathi or Bengali or Hindi, into English. Not because we thought everybody would run around performing all these language plays in English, but English was the link language where you, sitting in Hyderabad, could translate something from Manipur because you read it in English and said, I like this, I'll go to the original and translate. So it was, in a sense, retrospectively, it took 30 years of this before these books started to become texts. Habib Tanveer Charandas Chor, Tendulkar's Ghasiram Kotwal, these are all texts now. So at that moment, it was just the excitement that nobody had done it before. And you did so it became, there was a very exciting cinema movement at that time. Satyajit Ray, Adur Gopalakrishnan, Mrinal Sen, Shambha, so you were documenting. There was a 10-year period of very rich cinema that you would know. So you started to do the screenplays. So that's how the early Seagull started. Yeah, so so that I think sort of answers roughly the very beginnings of how we chose to get into publishing. I mean, there are other aspects of it, but there will come a time later where, it took us a long time to build a backlist. And in the backlist, what happens is that you sell small numbers across that, and then your economics work out. It's not the success of one book. And we learned very early again on the job that sometimes, let us say, Satyajit Ray's screenplays of the Apu trilogy could sell 5,000 copies, but maybe Jabbar's Threshold could only sell 500. So you learnt cross-subsidizing, which is actually a negative word in today's publishing. Today's publishing wants every book to be a profit center, what is known as a profit and loss, a PLN. So editors like you and me, when we are pitching something to our bosses in a publishing environment of a large house, we have to prove, I'm commissioning this book, but I expect to sell this much. This is it. So you need to work that out. It's impossible for anybody, because no amount of market research will teach you how eventually that book buyer is going to absorb what you have put out. What you put out may be half a dozen or 20 people's excitement in your publishing house, but you don't know that will translate into 2,000 or 20,000 people, right? It's a chance you take. You can't research that truth of readers or emotional truth of readers to be in sync with what you've published. So it's hard to be a profit and loss thing. Even they look at the media, look at the, wonderful places like, let us take, if I'm in Calcutta, the Ananda Bazar group that we've always grown up with, they used to have a lovely magazine, a literature magazine called Desh, But then there came a time when that literary magazine had to change its content because it was asked to become a profit center. Whereas there were other magazines and papers around it which were capable of funding it. That's the important thing. Even now, we've kept that principle in Seagull this is our 42nd year, where it's always a handful of books that fund a lot of the other books. It's cash flow, right? It's not about every book must make a profit or a loss kind of thing. So I don't know if that explains it, but the other jump would happen in 2005 when we decided, and so something we were informally, you and I, talking about, which is the the politics of a certain geographical location. So here you are in India for X number of years, maybe over 2 decades, doing these wonderful books which everybody's loving. The community of publishers also love you. They don't find you competitive because you're publishing in a very serious niche. So yeah, it's not. And so everyone's showing you off to the world, as it were. But even now, after 75 years of independence, the English speaking West expects Indian publishers to buy the right to sell within our country or our subcontinent, right? Whereas we felt at that point, when the word globalization hadn't totally lost its meaning, that in a globalized world we should be anywhere. It doesn't matter, our location is not important. As long as there is courtesy of visibility for your authors and distribution, then why should I just buy rights for India? I could buy rights for the world. I do good looking books. That was the feeling. And if my money is the same as yours. So we experimented and we set up Seagull Books London Limited. And the whole political twist to that was that you're a registered tax paying entity based in England. Your location changes. You're no longer in a black hole called Calcutta. So suddenly you're a UK based company. And suddenly everybody wants to distribute you because you're doing good looking books. So that was an amusing thing for us, that kind of a thing. But we also told ourselves that in the beginning we would be a registered independent tax paying publishing house, not a branch or anything, just incorporated in Great Britain. And we would deal with the world. We would buy world rights, and we were distributed by the University of Chicago Press. And the idea was not to spend money on infrastructure, have staff and offices. The production, in any case, most British publishers are outsourcing to other countries. You're typesetting in Pondicherry or Chennai, so you're publishing Korea or Hong Kong or China. So we said we have infrastructure in Calcutta. That becomes the servicing thing. So that experiment is over 500 books old. We own world rights to this. We are distributed by the University of Chicago Press, 14 years. At that point, the decision, the choice of what the content would be, you're going from a certain Indian theatre, cinema, culture studies into something more international, on which the Indian end would ride piggyback eventually. But at that point, we were, into translations. We turned to Europe. You have to understand at that point, the world, the English speaking world, let us say, was not encouraging translated literature. It had disappeared. When I was growing up, it was there in the 70s, late 60s, even early 80s. India was full of it because somebody was doing it. And then later, in their wisdom, the American publishing houses or the British ones felt that perhaps translation does not sell enough for them to meet their numbers. So slowly it disappeared. I'm talking the English speaking world, everywhere. Because the chain effect is you see, after all, how were books getting to India? You have to understand. A handful of importers, distributors in Daryaganj and in Calcutta. Old man Rupa, who was a legendary figure who started Rupa, he used to import some of the best books because they were being done. So he could choose and he could bring in literature. But when it stopped happening, it was difficult to do that. So I found that when I turned to European literature to translate, I remember it was going to be 100 years of Jean-Paul Sartre, and I went to Gallimard and I asked for various Sartre volumes. There was great confusion as to why would you want to do this for India, and it was interesting because it took us a while to explain that we wanted world rights of a French writer called Jean-Paul Sartre, and that we were going to translate, not sitting in New Delhi at 2 rupees a word with some commercial translator who does business letters for consulates, but the person who translates Sartre. And we went to Chris Turner And we paid in those days £70 per 1,000 words. That was the rate then, set by the UK Translators Association. So you were learning that you had to get the best of everything to get the quality to make a name. And once they were convinced and the first books came out, it opened a floodgate because then you could show they are distributed, they are reaching America, they are reaching New Zealand, and they're reaching Australia through Chicago's network. But what was interesting at that moment in time was that when the Americans bought rights from the French or the Germans or the Italians, they would often buy just for the US and Canada. The UK would buy just for the UK. Some of them would buy for the world, but they could never get to India because their pricing didn't work. I was offering them India as a given at a subsidized rate. We were letting the dollar market subsidize the rupee. And I was giving them America and Australia and everything using their own systems of distribution and so on. So that it's not as easy as it sounds, but that's the magic of theatre. You make something look like it is very simple, but it is exciting. And you have to remember that the nature of independent publishing is precarious worldwide. It's not just Seagull. It's everybody. There are some wonderful independents in this country, and there are some wonderful independents in the rest of the world that we admire and respect. And they all have to be on their toes constantly, right? It is a tightrope act. You're juggling resources, but you're not giving into a certain kind of philosophy that says, we actually wish to publish this kind of serious literature, but to make that possible, we have to do 70% of something else. It doesn't work. I think you should rather accept the fact that we're going to do 70% of what brings in the money and 30% of something else. It's okay. But, you don't fool yourself. Or you have to do what a lot of independents like us do, which is you somehow persist with just like a wish list of what you feel needs to be published, right? Because you cannot allow the distraction of what you perceive as a popular something that will, no, eventually the market has a way of finding its way to you if you build enough pressure. So when you have a corpus of 500, 600, 700, 800, 900 books over, they get noticed. It takes that kind of patient persistence to be able to get noticed in today's difficult publishing environment. And the other thing that is often asked is, are you threatened? In the old days, we were asked, are you threatened by the ebook? Are you threatened by this? So, and I used to sometimes joke and say, where's the time to be threatened? Or one would say that we like producing the book as an object, but we do it by using the very technology that you claim is threatening us. We do ebooks, it's useful. And we do it not necessarily as a revenue earner, so much as a reinvention. You're the author. You're alive. We owe it to you to keep your book from disappearing. Because in today's world, the way distribution works, every season, every 6 months, your book becomes history and something else is replaced. So here you do hardback. A bunch of salespeople from Chicago promote it. 6 months later, it disappears. You do other hardbacks. Then 18 months later, you bring back this book as a paperback. So they push it again for another 6 months. You bring in the ebook as simultaneously. Now we're turning our entire list into audiobooks. So what you're doing is what publishers are meant to do. If you're a dead author, it's even more interesting. We handle the estates of Mahashwata Devi and Nabarun Bhattacharya, her son, and we keep reinventing. You're doing paperback, hardback, new editions, sometimes new translations, sometimes pairing books together. The whole idea is to keep, you don't want a dead archive of a backlist. You want books that are continuously, and therefore you have to embrace the technology. If the young people are listening to Spotify, put the audiobook onto Spotify. It's perfectly all right. It brings them to the book eventually.
My next question is a bit lengthy and it includes an embarrassing admission. We started interviewing translators a few months ago, about 9 months ago. Arunava Sinha, then Tess Lewis, Owen Good, and Sawad Hussain, Ross Schwartz, Laura Norgard. Their books they have published from one company called Seagull Publishing. And suddenly, one fine morning, we realized that it is from our own Calcutta. So, being in Calcutta, right, the environment, what is the effect you think it had on Seagull's sensibility?
Well, it's hard to, you don't consciously set out to, I mean, I think you're living and breathing in a certain environment. I was born and brought up in Calcutta, which was a very open, cosmopolitan space. And I often think of the fact that in the late 60s, 70s, throughout, one was in and out of communities. And when I say in and out of communities, I mean homes and festivals and relationships and food and music and dancing and all of that. You were surrounded by Armenians and, Jewish friends and Chinese and Parsis. I mean, there was no, I mean, the whole thing was so cosmopolitan, which was a limited word. And much later, ironically, if you want to make a connection, if you're that kind of a person, we're doing 23 world literatures. So our community of publishing, the books on our shelves remind me of a kind of micro Calcutta of the 70s, right? But for us, there was never, it was always a kind of retrospective method or magic. When you look back, you see a certain logic unfolding. But when you're actually doing it in the thick of it, like this conversation, it cannot be rehearsed because I don't know what you're going to ask me. You don't know where I am going to go. I don't know it either. I'm intuitively trying my best to find you answers. So, similarly, when you're working in the arts and culture and in an environment where you believe, and that has changed now, people are often these days debating. What is the role of the publisher? Does a publisher contribute to the intellectual climate of a nation, a city, a community? There are no easy answers. How many of us are thinking about it, especially post 2014 and 19? What are we really consciously in India thinking about what we're contributing to the intellectual climate? If you look at the bookshelves, what are we publishing? So it's a tricky thing. But when you're actually in the thick of doing it, of course, the city is very much a part of me. I used to very casually often repeat and say that for me, if you threw me anywhere in the world, I would survive, that kind of thing. But the truth is that I survived here. And that my journey to the rest of the world continues to find its way home to the city, in the most comfortable kind of way. And the city has always been very hospitable. And not just to art and culture as it's made out, right? The Bengali culture, the intellectual aura and all of that. I think it's hospitable every which way. People still just drop in. I don't have to make an appointment with you in Hyderabad. I just drop in and you will give me food, literally. In food in all aspects of it, to eat, to think, all of that. And it's remained a fairly old-fashioned, affectionate, warm city, despite all the changes that as a Calcutta I may be upset about, or exhausted with. it's a less what should I say? It's yeah, it is. It's so much a part of you that you almost don't notice it. It's an intuitive imbibing, right? And so yes, but if you you can't create a chart out of this or an Excel sheet of what was imbibed when. But yes, it continues to give me sustenance, and including the fact that you survived here doing theatre to start with, and then the documenting of theatre, then the more tangible, which is the books, because the ephemeral, the theatre disappears after the opening night, and the book remains in a certain way, and so on and so forth. But to me, the learning of the theatre is constantly on a daily basis. There is a lesson that I can use in concrete terms in my publishing world, because theatre teaches you a certain hospitable way of solving problems with very little resources, right? That's the magic of theatre. You may have a king wearing a golden crown, but it's actually not cloth at all. It could be just some gold painted wire mesh from Chandni Chowk, that you wear it in a certain way. So there's a lot of that's it's constantly, and it's intuitively crisscrossing you, the choices you make, the risks you take. But yes, the city is very important.
Now, how do you think your sensibilities as a reader helped in building Seagull books?
I think the reading helps because, as I told you, when we decided to play first world publisher in 2005 with third world currency, as it were, in other words, go international, build an international list. I said to you that I turned to Europe, and I've said this to death often in print and otherwise, where I grew up reading European literature, you know. You may have grown up reading the Bible or the Gita or the Quran to find solutions to your problem. I used to turn to the darkest of literature. And it just happened to be from different parts of Europe, which would give me little solace, right? That I was not alone in my whatever, darkness and so on and so forth. And so the reading, that made me think that I wanted to go to the French and the Germans first, which was the initial reaching out before all the other languages. And what was interesting was that reading is like, it's this, when you hold a book, I'll give you a very concrete example of how the detective work happens even in publishing and how it happens in reading. I recently, some months ago, discovered a colored Canadian poet called Dion Brand. And it was a book published by my friends in Duke University Press. It was called Nomenclature. It was 600 pages of poetry. And I didn't know whether I was desperately excited or just angry that I hadn't read her before. And it had a critical introduction, which was equally exciting, by a woman called Christina Sharp. And I'm saying, here are these two people I don't know. And I started, and I found that Dion Brand had done 20 other books, fiction, essay, poetry. And Christina Sharp had done 2 others and one new book, which has won the National Book Award in America, called Ordinary Notes. And when I started to read them, and when I was reading them, it led me to other poets that they write about and read about, and it became a chain of things. And then before you knew it, you'd done about 30 books of different people, about as many as 9 people, and that is exactly how the publishing also happens. You begin Seagull, the international part, with something which is Jean-Paul Sartre, Paul Celan, Ingeborg Bachmann, Adorno, Kluger, Enzensberger, Artaud. So you're going to these classics you grew up with, some alive, some not so alive. And then what do? You don't know what's happening because you don't know the literatures any longer, you don't know the languages. And so then you turned instinctively, I did something, which is I turned, thankfully, because of my lack of structure, to a bunch of translators like Tess or Chris. And I said, "What are you reading?" And then they started to discover younger, exciting writing for me. And I started to trust them and blindly started to publish them. So it became a circle of trust with the translators. Watching this happening, certain publishers in France and Italy, German, figured out this is what we need to find from our archives for this man's house. So it grew. It's not a one-man show, right? So it is these circles of trust that, they, and you see, it's like a bookstore. If the bookstore owner, and we have enough traditions of these wonderful bookshop owners in this country too, you have regular customers and you give them books that you find for them. Fine. But there's a certain kind of bookseller who reads and has taste, which he's dying to share with you. He knows these are not the kind of books you buy, but he wants you to read them. And when he shares those new things for you, you get excited because you didn't think he used to stock them. It's a lot of detective work, which intuitively happens. You go to the footnotes of every book and you find ways of saying, oh, somebody's done this, somebody's quoted this. That sounds like it rings a bell in my head. So it's a process which is very hard to put into a structure. But if you talk about it in a passionate enough way, I think it gets across to a lot of younger people and it kind of grows in that. So the reading is a parallel exercise. You cannot publish and avoid, right? And you cannot publish everything. So you have to celebrate other publishers. This is important to understand. It's not, this is the one wonderful business which is not cutthroat. I'm not trying to steal you away from, I mean, of course, authors shift and move, and all of that happens. And sometimes you feel heartache. Somebody who published 4 books moves on to somebody else. Yes, but it isn't like a certain kind of corporate or advertising world where sometimes people are, taken away in a certain kind of way. But so we've, at least at the Seagull level, all of us, it's a small team, and we've constantly celebrating on our social media the publishing community, because it is, after all, a community. And that's important.
The cover design of each book. That is something truly special. And the other day I was going through your website where your catalogs, rights catalogs, that design too is so beautiful. And you being a photographer, I would say an accomplished visual artist, what kind of effort goes into it?
Before a young person called Shunandari Banerjee walked in from her university to be a editor, assistant editor, every single book was designed by me using my photographs and other people's art. And, we were printing in a different technology, blocks were being made, and offset was just beginning to transition. And I had self-taught myself to design this, and I used to set the insides of every computers. Apple Macintosh had come into it. Desktop publishing was happening. But when this young person came, who was also totally untrained, she came in and grew parallelly as an editor. She grew as a translator, and she grew as a designer. And I sensed my only role was of letting go, which is that recognizing a very sensitive, a superior sensibility. And when I say sensibility, I mean reading. This was a reading being, and therefore could make connections which translated into design. Again, a person who couldn't draw, but who took to computers and a digital technology to create what she calls digital collages. And the design aesthetic not only changed, it kind of grew in stature. And when we started Seagull London, we were told by our distributors, oh, the UK books have a certain aesthetic. You need a different cover for the US, and you're different. She broke all those rules and said her covers work. This one cover, one book published simultaneously across the globe works. It works in Japan and New Zealand and Cambodia and everywhere else. There's a kind of something that comes across. So I have no credit here other than letting go after recognizing that this person is doing something special. So it was not at the cost, she was not designing at the cost of any of her other skills. So she's the chief editor, and she is also the chief designer, and she translates. So that's, and she makes art, which is exhibited and sold, and that kind of thing. So the photography, interestingly, and if I may add, the writing. So I've been doing photography for, in analog before the advent of the digital for like my theatre days, right? But in some strange ways, it was always for myself. For example, we show art and photography, but you cannot show in your own space your own work. Similarly, for almost 12 years now, I write every single day. All of that happened accidentally many years later. Like my photography started to get shown and actually sell these last few years because Chatterjee and Lal found their way to me and I found my way to them, and they became my gallery. And so what I'm saying is that till that happened in the public exhibition space, it was all being used along with many other photographers and artists who are part of the Seagull fraternity by Shunandri. These were all used in design. Our other editorial designer colleague, Bishan Samada's photography is also used. Her own, so it's, as she says, she's like a magpie that takes from here and there and creates something kind of stuff. But yes, all of my recognizing design or appreciating or celebrating design, anybody's, not just ours, has to, I think I would still connect it to theatre, where I would very confidently, even now, I feel very good in a nicely, affectionately arrogant kind of way of being able to walk into any space, and I think I can do something with the space and turn it into some form of theatrical magic. It's possible. The book cover space itself is a piece of theatre because it leads you into the book. It attracts you, There's things happening there. It's not competitive with the author's intent. On the contrary, like lighting is not supposed to compete with the directorial intent. You're Zakir Hussain, who's capable of a solo, but you have to subdue that image in the nicest possible way to a Hari Prasad Chaurasia. You're an accompanist. So, all of these things come into it. But yeah, she's the one, and her role as a translator, you mentioned a lot of translators, and you really need to read some of her Mahashvatas or her Navarun Bhattacharya. It's absolutely wonderful way with being able to, language in a certain kind.
Somehow, every response, you take it back and connect it to theatre, including your cover design. That's beautiful.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to visibility of books, making it reach the reader, what is Seagull's approach?
Seagull's approach has been, over the last 42 years, and remains exploratory. You never rest. It's never satisfactory enough because of many things. If you remember when, or you may have heard about this, you may not remember it, which is that when we started, distribution within the Indian context, we found that, of course, traditionally everybody wants to exclusively distribute you. But we discovered very soon in the Indian context that no single distributor knew this vast, many Indias. So we started, for example, in those days with Orient Longman, which was Orient Black Swan now. And we found that they did a certain kind of good job in, let us say, the Maharashtrian end, but were not so good in the north, right? They did well in the Bengal. So we discovered very soon by exploratory methods that we need to have 4 distributors in different regions. So we went through that. It still wasn't satisfactory. Then you found the distributors and a growing retail. It was very hard for these distributors to read retail. What they had between them were lots of sub-wholesalers, Through all of this, in those days, we used to depend a lot on what we used to call direct mailing and postcards and we found small town India was reading and reaching out to you, with somebody sitting in some small town wanting, Adur Gopalakrishnan thing and play script by so and Jabbar Patel. And they would send you a postcard. And you said, oh my God, how did it even get there? Sub wholesalers, that kind of thing. But the effort has to be now. If you jump to all the resources at your command, whether it's social media or whether it's mailing in a certain way, lots of direct selling is something we've discovered beyond to help the distributors' efforts. Within the Indian context, in the beginning, you have to realize that there's a huge. The way distribution works is that there are very few wholesalers who distribute for the big houses. So whether it's Penguin or Bloomsbury or HarperCollins, they would all go through a particular wholesaler who then creates a hierarchy of who's doing what and who brings in what kind of income for them. So it's not easy. In the Western world, where we discovered that we're distributing, when I say through University of Chicago Press, what do? They warehouse, they promote, they represent. There's a more structured thing. India discovered structures of distribution when the multinationals came in and started all these houses. Before that, you and I used to get our books ready and then go and look for buyers, literally, The process at the Chicago level also taught us that you start a year in advance. You get the translated manuscript, you announce it a year in advance, and all the systems there are geared, libraries, institutions, booksellers, orders. So if you delay a book, there's a backlog of cancellations because they want it on a certain date. So there's a lot of that. But the small independent publisher, to come to that in a focused way, has to constantly do promotional activity to help this chain. You have to engage with booksellers all over. You have to, because no bookseller has the luxury in today's technological world of stocking your entire list. Shelf space is at a premium. Forget the chains, I'm talking the independent, wonderful independent bookstores. Because you're 3 clicks away, right? So if Naveen's published 20 books, you may keep the last 3 on the shelf, but you can get 17 from Speaking Tiger. It's question. So people are keeping the new replaces the almost immediate, which gets shifted back and so on and so forth because it's at a premium. So promotion constantly, people are doing. Whether you're big or small, you're doing events, you're doing discussions. The space has shrunk for writing and talking about books. What you're doing is unique. You're talking about books here, right? But how many people are doing that? They're doing it on Instagram, they're doing it on Twitter, But the newspapers and print that we grew up with, where we believed the written review, whether it was a drama critic, film critic, or a book critic, there was a kind of love-hate thing. If they loved you, you loved them back, and if they hated you, you were upset. But now it's shrunk between the Hindu and the frontline, and just a few people doing this. But so it's not an easy thing. No one has the answers. Everybody is trying their best. And you see, and we do 50 books a year, for example. And so therefore you have to give attention to each of those. Sometimes, and visibility is the most important thing. I don't even worry about sales. I keep telling my distributors, make the book visible. Because then there's choice of you and me as a book buyer. But if we don't have visibility, and for us, we've been through the whole good, bad, ugly of visibility and invisibility, and we've had everything. We've had great years where you've been awarded all kinds of wonderful things, where you've had a lot of attention. You've been picked up by the NYRB and LRB, and reviewed, and but you never know, because you're doing the same for every book, but you don't know who is going to pick up what, which trigger is going to make a book visible in the New York reviews, or I'm talking the American context. So I think all of this is a constant endeavor. You owe it to the authors to keep at it, right? And therefore, it's pointless responding in frustration or annoyance to authors. Some authors are more connected in the social media world and appear to be pushy, but the point is, it is their life's output at that moment. It is the most important thing for them. You have to recognize, and therefore you have to provide that. It's a kind of together thing. It's not us and them here. It's some do it better than others, and the trick is to sort of over, I think, the last 10, 12 years, we've discovered slowly, and particularly during the pandemic, the power of reaching you directly. In other words, it's fine to have your internet sales at 3 clicks away, Amazon and all the rest of it. But it's also about a certain word of mouth, and that is generated by you being able to build a list of people that buy from you, reach out to them constantly. We keep doing, because selling from your website is also very important. Selling through bookstores is also very important. What is also even far more interesting, which we are noticing still, because now computerized records of sales and location are possible, that we sell the more serious, interesting, translated European literature outside the metros. There's a lot of books that get there. We have these wonderful little distributors in Atlanta. See, so we have a situation post-pandemic where we have Penguin, Pan Macmillan, and a wonderful company called Atlantic, publishers and distributors in Delhi. Atlantic has a vast network of over 200 sub-wholesalers, booksellers everywhere in the country, and they just give it to them on credit. Penguin and Pan Macmillan are more retail-oriented, more metro-oriented, and that kind of stuff. And I find, if you look and analyze the kind of books being bought in quote unquote, in Pankaj Mishra's terms, from his wonderful butter chicken in Ludhiana, small town India. I mean, nothing is small town India with our population, but you know what I mean. So if people in Ludhiana and Patna are reading something about a Bavarian widow because it rings a chord in their head, to me, that's success.
The other interesting thing, which is an admirable thing, is the pricing of your books. All are within 600, 700 rupees, comes down to about $8 or even less. That is amazing for the kind of quality of printing that you have in your books. I have about 10 titles with me from Seagull now. So how do you manage to do that?
It's really pure intent. There's no logic of a mathematical kind. You have a notional idea that if you can, sell enough in a dollar economy, you should be able to subsidize it here. But in real terms, it doesn't quite work out like that. You're also recognizing the fact that within the Indian cultural book buying culture context, there's just so much you and I are willing to spend on a book, right? Because you're within, this is your community, this is your structure, superstructure, whatever you want to call it, and therefore you can't suddenly price them in a way that it competes at par with, let us say, the American pricing, or the British pricing, and so on and so forth. So we do notionally subsidize, A book sells for $7 because it sells $27 somewhere else. But in practice, it's very hard to keep tabs of that. Sometimes within the Indian context, you sell enough numbers to justify that very small margin that you keep, right? So if I was to treat each book as a profit center, this would fall flat. It just wouldn't work because it's always a handful of books that do gloriously well, and therefore you're also subsidizing 10 other books that need to be done that may not do well at the moment of their birth, but 5 years later, they're still in circulation. That's what's important. But I think you're the first one who's told me that our pricing is very reasonable. No one, everybody says, oh, give us a discount.
No, you have to compare it with the right ones, with the same quality of printing and content.
Yeah. But we don't want to sacrifice quality. It's very important
Right,
that the
right.
texture of
Yes,
paper, fabric,
yes.
binding, all of that. And so that's important.
No, that's the reason as a reader I invest in hard copy, right? That is the sole reason, just to have the feel of it.
Yeah.
When it comes to translations, I think there are about 25 different languages. You have your catalog is about 25 different languages. There are translations into English, right?
I haven't really
I
counted,
think
but maybe it's a
approximately
little
25.
less,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah.
But when you see the regional Indian languages, I would say, not regional languages, Indian languages, there are very few, I think 2 or 3, if I count it. I think Bengali, Hindi, and
But
Urdu.
largely
Bengali,
Bengali, yeah,
Urdu
because
also, I guess.
that's
Right.
right.
So, what is the reason?
No, I'll tell you, we've actually, when we started here, we were doing basically translating theatre scripts from different Indian languages, right? So of course, you had Marathi, which was very strong, and you had Malayalam, and you had Tamil, and you had Hindi and Bengali, but then there came this insistence that we would build an international list, which we did, and then we neglected, while we were doing that for 10 years, we were guilty of neglecting the what we call the India list. And then we came back to it when we were confident that now there is interest in things that we are publishing with the Indian context outside. Then we discovered that there were such wonderful publishers already doing translations from all sorts of Indian languages. The bigger ones are doing a lot of that. So we chose to stick to the languages that we were familiar with. So Bengali became automatic. Also relationships, our relationships with Mahashwata Devi and Namarun Bhattacharya, and handling their legacy and estate for the son and grandson, and there's a lot of keeps us at that level. So it became accidentally that, and now a lot of the Hindi. It isn't a deliberate choice except for the Bangla. What would be interesting is if, say, for example, you were to bring a particular, if you bring a Telugu book to me which makes sense to you, and you take the responsibility and say, Naveen, I want to build a Telugu list for you. I'd say, do it, because I can't, right? So it's literally like that. So the only list that I was responsible for, French and German in a strange way, but the Italian has a series editor, the Arab has a series editor. People who came into our lives and asked the same question you did, what about this and what about that? We haven't done the Latin American enough because nobody came into nobody, so we've done some Borges and stuff. So a lot of it is a kind of accidental, the Slovak list happened in the same way, and now we're looking at Latvia and we're looking at, Czech and so on and so forth, because somebody at some point, like you, will find a connect and say, I'm taking the responsibility, which only means locating, a curatorial detective work of finding interesting things, not to physically edit. The other thing is that translation is a very expensive project, right? In the sense that the gestation period is longer. You're continuing to pay translations, then you get it out, then it sells, then it brings in some kind of money. And the support structures for translations within this country is also something that needs to be strengthened. Interestingly, I'm also noticing that the languages within the domestic situation, people are translating each other's, right? Certain kinds of books. And we're also now discovering that some of our books, for example, the Robila Thapar, one or two books that we are happening in multiple Indian languages. Mahashvata has always happened in multiple Indian languages. Um, my own poetry has happened in 7, 8 languages, including in Urdu in Pakistan and so on. So there is a lot of scope for that, but it doesn't translate into large sums for anybody. Because, like you talked about pricing being reasonable, the languages expect even more reasonable pricing in a certain way, right? The language publishers are still trying to keep a kind of, they don't match the English language pricing. It's become much. So it's a kind of complicated thing. We would love to see other languages make their way to us. But if it happens organically, yeah, it's not like a strategy that we have to do 10 books of this or 10 books of that. Sometimes you find in a particular season you've done 7 of a certain language and only 2 of another language. Some of it has to do with the ecosystem of when you set the translation into motion, when it comes home. There was a big backlog during the pandemic. You missed seasons. Suddenly you had lots of books, but you have to phase them out.
Now, you were involved with the art, literature, and theatre for the last 5 decades or so. The current socio-political scenario that is prevailing in the country and across the world, how do you think literary ecosystem, writers, publishers can respond to that? This is my last question.
Well, they're responding all the time. A certain kind of writer is choosing to go with the political dispensation of the time and becoming part of that ecosystem. And then there are others, something interesting that I've, often talked about, which is that in our current climate, you can have a situation where a certain sized publisher has the capability of what I call pushing back because of their sheer size and their contribution to the exchequer. But these publishers are very wary, and therefore a new editorial intervention is happening, which is called a legal edit. I'm no longer sending you a manuscript that is only copy edit, which is the term we grew up with, but you have a legal edit for every book where the author justifies, have you covered this track? If you said this, where is the proof? Did you hear a speech? Where is the link to that YouTube speech? So censorship of the self, not quite. But something close to that is beginning to happen. You're preempting. It's like constantly living in anxiety of being attacked in a certain kind of way. So you can choose to therefore do that kind of publishing, or you can choose to do a kind of publishing where you focus on what you wish to do. You don't have to scream from the rooftops, but you just keep on doing it. You do what is essential to do. You stay with your authors. You do not have, like us, we don't have clauses in our contract which says responsibility, libel, legal is all yours and not ours. No, you're together. Once I've accepted your book, I'm fighting your battles with you. So therefore, you keep doing it till you're physically stopped. That's the anxiety now. In today's world climate, you can be stopped at any time from doing whatever you do. So there's a certain, if you want a romantic, you will say there is a certain creativity in this resistance. But to me, it's just negative energy worrying about something which will happen when it will happen. Then you face it, then you respond to it. I know it's slightly foolhardy not to be prepared, but Even sitting in, let's be specific, if you're sitting in New Delhi and you're being Speaking Tiger, you're publishing what you wish to publish. You're not going around mincing words or censoring. But this is not true of maybe some of the larger ones who feel they have more to lose, right? So you can't blame anybody for this. That's the other thing. Because you don't know the compulsions of a big house or a small house, or it's in the art world too. You can't just pick up the phone and scream at some artist because you feel that they have done something that has been involved with a governmental something or the other that you disagree with the ideology. Because everybody has compulsions, and we cannot sit on a high moral ground and say, do this, do that. You can only choose your own moral ground. So you have to, if you are the kind you wish to stand up and do what you wish to do, then you should do it. But you cannot point fingers, blame others, all of that. You can discuss it amongst yourselves. You can get upset. It's human to get upset with, oh, I wish they would do this, I would. But, and it's not just the Indian context. I'm talking here anywhere and everywhere in the world. See what is happening post 7th October. Right? Lots of cultures that I work with now, this time in Frankfurt, we were all under a shadow. I had promised Scroll I would do a kind of Frankfurt diary, and I did something, but it became, a kind of darker trajectory than a happy celebratory thing of books. So it's a difficult time, but there have been other difficult times. I call it, because of a photography project I did, I like to use the word cannibal time. In my head, there's a hierarchy with Hannah Arendt's Dark Times having lost its edge, and we need something else. So I use the word cannibal time, which may not be perfect, but it is that, it's eroding away. And therefore, you need very much to resist it in your own way. We have one or two authors who are resisting the business of books. They don't want to be part of the business of books. So they're continuing to write. There's one man who continues to write. But as he says, I write from my drawer. I don't want to be published because I don't like the business of books, and he has reasons for it. So, but it's all part of the way, our lives are. Somebody will one day look back and, find meaning. That's not your and my task. We can only sit here and explore our own thoughts and how much they affect others. Coming back to this business of building an intellectual climate, how I wish that was possible. There's not enough discussion happening amongst ourselves, even as publishers. There is a kind of sense of community as and when you have open access to people. But on the whole, it seems fairly lonely business. Each one is doing their own thing, mostly. I don't mean to end on a pessimistic note, because I really enjoy this business of the books, of the way we do them, and a lot of others like us who carry on doing it, which is why it works. It's like the country. The country works because there's enough like-minded people doing things. And doing is important. You cannot stop the doing, because it's always that. People want you to stop doing, raise your hands up skywards and constantly look like supplicants wanting your elected representatives to drop little things into your palms. But that's not how it is meant to be. You have to be responsible for making this ecosystem. You have to find ways of doing the books that you wish to do. The world, the reader, nobody wants to know how you do it. So don't beat your chest about that. Do it. That's it. Get those books into the hands of the readers. No, it's important.
Wonderful. See, the best part about your responses is that though they are impromptu responses, because I changed all the questions that I have sent you, I felt like I was listening to an audio of a book
Thank you.
with beautiful structured prose. Thank you.
Thank you.